Good morning.
Good morning.
How was your stay last night? Everything is okay? Those who are not here last night, my name is Haruko Nawata Ward, and I work here. So if you have any problems, just let me know. I'm wearing my blue shoes today, so it's easy for you to spot me. So I have some announcements before the panel. Right after this panel, we will have group pictures taken. So don't leave. Junha will be guarding the door, so you cannot escape. We need to do this, so please stay, don't leave. And then we'll go to lunch. And during the lunchtime, you'll sign up for your workshop groups. Workshop 1 and workshop 2. Earlier one starts at 2, I believe, 2:30, and then the later one starts at 4 something. So look at the schedule. Look over the schedule and see what workshops are offered. And during lunchtime, please sign up so that we can know how many people will be there. Okay? Speaking for lunch, for some reason, it's already delivered. So I'm sorry that it's not going to be very warm, but it will be delicious. And we are supporting the local business. And it's, again, very greasy. And there's a lot of spill. So if you're wearing light colored clothes or any kind of clothes, be careful. The yellow of the curry will stain your clothes. So I am going to leave here to clean it up, but I'm just cautioning you. Okay? So that's lunch. I think the dinner is open for the community. So if you have friends, if you like to bring them, that's fine too, male too, okay? And our library staff put on a wonderful display of PANAAWTM authors' books. They only had a short notice, so some of the books didn't get bought. And so I have the latest one of Wonley Hall, Eco-Familiarism. It's very timely, so I'm going to pass this around. Don't steal it. Bring it back to Wonley. Can you stand up? Bring it back to her after you're done, okay? I'm going to pass this around. And finally, I have a personal interest in making you historians. So I belong to some historians movement. So Ritchie Institute for Chinese Western Council History at the University of San Francisco has been giving wonderful workshops. Those who are studying about Christianity in Asia. There's going to be one in Japan this summer, and it's for postdoctorate people. So I'm going to leave the brochures here. I only printed out about this workshop in Japan, but they have them across Asia and across United States. So I encourage you to look up their website. Am I missing something? Announcement. I will make another announcement. So don't leave after the panel. Okay? Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning.
Supak and Chungha will be collecting W9 form and scholarship form, maybe, between workshops 1 and 2 at the registration desk downstairs. I will repeat this after.
Good morning. My name is Kwok Pui Lan. I am a visiting professor at Kendra School of Theology at Emory University. This morning, I will be moderating this panel on Journey Towards Justice, Embodying Knowledge, and Asian American women's contribution to theology and religious studies. Some of you may know that as a group, PANAAWTM has published 2 books. The first one is entitled Off the Menu, published in 2007. And what is the second book? Anybody who knows the second book? Leading Wisdom. And it was published several years ago. And we are preparing for our 3rd volume, which is called Asian and Asian American Women's Contribution to Theology and Religion, Embodying Knowledge. That is why this morning we have invited several of the contributors to this volume that is forthcoming from Palgrave next year to share with us what they have thought about this particular topic, how their work, their scholarship has embodied the theme of this conference, which is Journey Towards Justice. As you know that, PANAAWTM is a very diverse group, coming from different national, geographical, racial, and ethnic backgrounds. And we are so glad that this time we have 2 colleagues from the Pacific Islands to make the name even fully embodied. Pacific, Asian, and North American Asian women in theology and ministry. We envisage this panel to be very conversational. So it is not like a panel that you usually have seen. One by one, they will talk about their own life and their own scholarly work. This is a conversational, dialogical panel. And then, after the break, you will also be invited to join this conversation and also asking questions from the panelists. I am delighted to introduce the 4 distinguished panelists. Sitting to my far left is Dr. Nami Kim, who is the chair and associate professor in the Religion of Philosophy and Religious Studies at Spelman College. She is a US-based Korean woman and has taught in this predominantly Black college since 2004. She is the author of The Gendered Politics of Korean Protestant Religious Right. And with Dr. Ann Cho, she has co-edited this very important volume called Critical Theology Against US Militarism in Asia. One of her ongoing research subjects is about Afro-Black and Asian connections. We will hear more about this research later as she speaks. Sitting next to Dr. Kim is Dr. Rita Nagashima-Brock, who identifies herself as Japanese-American HAPA. She is Senior Vice President and Director of the Shane Moral Injury Center of Volunteers of America. Before that, she was the founding director of the Soul Repair Center at Bright Divinity School. And before that, Dr. Brock has served as a professor, an activist, and also an administrator. Among her many books include Journeys by Heart, Proverbs of Ashes, and also the book that she co-authored that is called Soul Repair, Recovering from Moral Injury After War. Dr. Brock is also the first Asian American woman to receive a doctorate in theology in the United States.
I beat her by 1 year.
And sitting next to Dr. Kim is Dr. May-An Lee Tran, who is Associate Professor of Religious Studies and Practical Theology at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. She is a Vietnamese American and a past president of the Religious Education Association and an ordained elder of the California-Nevada Conference of the United Methodist Church. She is the author of this very important book that is called Reset the Heart, Unlearning Violence, Relearning Hope, and many chapters and articles. And sitting to my immediate left is Dr. Gail Yee. For 18 years, Dr. Gail Yee and I were colleagues at Episcopal Divinity School, where she has served as the Nancy King Professor of Biblical Studies. And she is currently the first Asian American and the first woman of color president of this prestigious organization called the Society of Biblical Literature. And among her many publications are The Poor Banished Children of Eve and her newly released edited volume, The Hebrew Bible, Feminist and Intersectional Perspectives. Please join me in welcoming our four very distinguished panelists. I want to ask them to introduce to you more personally by talking about how did they decide to study theology or religion. Maybe we start with Dr. Kim.
So when I was a middle school student, I remember 8th grade, I read about the Doctors Without Borders in the newspaper. So since then, I had a very clear goal of becoming a medical doctor so that one day I can join Doctors Without Borders. But that changed when I fell sick, seriously ill, being hospitalized for 40 days in my senior year high school. So while at hospital, not only I realized how much I hated scenes, smells, and sounds at the hospital, and felt pity for these sleep-deprived medical doctors who walk like zombies. But I also started asking, questions about life, death, illness, suffering, existence of God, and so forth. So feminist theologians Carol Adams and Marie Fortune said that the traumatic event challenges an ordinary person to become a theologian, a philosopher, and jurist. So after experiencing this physical and existential crisis as a teenager in my own small world, I decided to study religion theology in college, because I thought that studying religion would answer all my questions. Well, I'm not sure about that. But I decided to pursue MDiv after working as an intern at a battered women's shelter for 1 year, where I met many victim survivors of domestic violence who literally believed that they suffer because they sinned against God the Father. So they made me, really think that what are all these things? So I, decided to pursue MDiv. So that's how, I began my journey in theological studies.
Yes. Now, Gail, I know that at one time you wanted to be a medical doctor too, was heading that route. Can you share your experience?
Yes. Talking with Boy Young right before this, she was saying, I never would have dreamed to be a professor, and now I was a professor. I never would have dreamed I would be a dean, and now I'm a dean. Well, I never would have thought I would be a biblical scholar, but now I'm a biblical scholar. Yes, I did start out in pre-med in college, but I couldn't pass a math course. I flunked algebra 3 times. I don't even want to talk about chemistry. But I did very well in my interpretation of text, in my poetry courses and my English literature courses. And so, and then in college, what happened was I was on a Tese retreat, which I had no idea what Tese was, but just became so enthralled that I was on the first contingent of U.S. Young people to go to their first conference for the Council of Youth from the U.S. And so I met all these people from 50 different countries, 5 simultaneous translations in 5 different languages. I came back, you know, from the U.S. wanting to go and preach the gospel, so I got involved in the Catholic Charismatic Renewal. So I was leading prayer meetings over at Loyola University, and one guy stood up and said, I shouldn't be leading because I'm a woman. And I, you know, me who have never read the Bible at all, where's this to say? So at the time, I was the secretary of the dean at Loyola. And so all these theology people would come in and sit in front of me while they're waiting for their appointment. So I said, look at, you know, what's this about, you know, women not being able to teach? And he says, you need to go and study theology. So that's how I did the MA, and then went on to my PhD, first in New Testament, and then ended up in Old Testament.
How about you, Rita? Did you think about going into the medical field or not?
Oh yeah. My dad had been I grew up in a military family. I was born in Japan. I didn't speak English till I was 6. My family in Japan was Buddhist. So the whole time I was going to military-based Protestant services, things, Christianity did not make any sense to me. And when I was 12, they said you should read the Bible cover to cover. So I read the Bible cover to cover, and I discovered that Jesus was really like a rude white guy. So this whole thing with Jesus, you know, loving, caring, no, he yells at people, calls them names. It was like so un-Japanese behavior that I was like totally puzzled by Christianity. But I wound up in high school there were several other incidents. Like I lived in Mississippi for a year when there were race riots, and I was the only non-white person in my junior high. So there was all these incidences in my life that didn't make sense, and they came to coherent college. But my parents were in medicine. My mother was a nurse. My dad was a medic in Vietnam. So I went, and I had really good test scores on the SATs in math and science. My verbal scores were lower. So I went off to college thinking I would be a neurosurgeon. That was my plan. But in my senior year, I met a person who's still a good friend, whose father was a Baptist minister, and I wanted to be part of that community of church because it was such a supportive community. So I asked him to baptize me, even though I believed in evolution. He was willing to baptize me. It was very fundamentalist. They were like all the literal truth of the Bible, and none of that ever made any sense to me. But I just kind of said what you're supposed to say, so I could get baptized and be a full member of that community. And his daughter Joy is still one of my best close friends. It's really interesting because she's still very Baptist. But anyway, I went off to college to be a doctor, and 2 months after I got there was a threat that all the black students would be killed if they weren't expelled, because this was Orange County, very conservative California county, very white supremacist. And so almost the entire student body got involved in civil rights work. It was just sudden uprising. And that's where I met Japanese Americans who were talking about yellow power, not exactly in a joking way, because that was when the Asian American movement was starting then. I nearly flunked out of college. I had a state scholarship for 4 years. I almost lost my first year because the science was so boring compared to marching to save people's lives and trying to integrate the city of Orange. And so my activism took my heart at that point. And I asked the student leaders, what should I take? I'm so bored. And they said, take Hebrew Bible, literature of the Old, they didn't call it that. They said, take the literature of the Old Testament class. It's the hardest and best class you'll take in college. And I was like, what? Bible? But I thought, well, I didn't have any other better plans. So I signed up, 70-year-old retired professor from Claremont Seminary, had Parkinson's, so he was hard to understand. I walked into class, tiny little man. And 10 minutes, when he started talking, I thought, I'm not going to be able to understand him. And 10 minutes into the class, I was hooked. He was just a brilliant teacher. And I not only it's the only class in college, only classes in college where I did all the work plus extra were for his classes. After that, I wanted to take everything he taught, and somewhere in the middle of that, he called me in his office and said, "What's your major?" I said, "I don't know." And he said, "Well, you know, you have quite a few credits in my classes in religion, and you only need this many more to have a major in religion." So I didn't have any better plans. So mostly I took intro to Hebrew, I took archaeology and the Bible, I took prophets and poetry and wisdom literature. I mean, I took every class he taught, and I got really immersed in the biblical stuff. And then he talked me into going to graduate school, which I wasn't planning to do. Between my college graduation and my entry into Claremont Seminary, and he got me a scholarship to go to do my graduate work, I read Ms. Magazine. And suddenly the Bible was the infector of patriarchy. And so I gave up on the Bible, and when I got to graduate school, that 3-month summer changed my mind about the Bible, and I decided to study theology because the God male thing in Mary Daly was a big deal. So that's a very short version of how I wound up studying religion, but that's how I got into theology.
Now, what about your journey, Maya? Was it so dramatic?
Significantly shorter. So I aced calculus A, B, and BC. Right? True to form. But now I can't add in my head, right? I am a 4th generation Vietnamese Christian, which is an anomaly, if you know the context, right? So in a context where religious plurality and autochthonous, right, religious and cultural expressions were just kind of exploding around us, but I have like vivid memory of being a child sitting behind our wired fence in our little home, my grandparents' home actually, because our family never owned a home in Vietnam, but behind claws, right, my fingers to the wire fence, watching a funeral procession of a neighbor down the street, right? The criers, the incense, right? The drumming. And I'm thinking in my head, as a child, like, this is heathen practices, right? That's going on in front of us. Because we were good Christians, right? And we were Protestant. So if you were Christian and not Catholic in Vietnam, you were evangelical Protestant. So my father was one, so I grew up a PK. How many PKs do we have here, right? So, okay, you know the routine, right? You do everything in the church, right? From the piano to the, mopping the floor and things like that. And so when our family came to the States, there's a long story, I grew up in the church and loved the church and knew that the church loved me. And so I went to seminary to be a good Sunday school teacher because I was teaching Sunday school. But as you know, seminary doesn't teach you new knowledge. It teaches you how to see the world, right? A good seminary education does that. So it descaled my eyes. And so a transition from learning the right theology to be a better Sunday school teacher to recognizing that there are multiple theological, right, knowledge worlds that I could choose from, hey, choice, but then to examining the grid of those choices, right, because you don't choose freely, that right, you're conscripted to choose in a particular way, so examining that, so the architecture of our knowledge is being examined, and then to being at this point, being in the company of people who've made choices and who've just broken the grid too, right? To walk off the grid. I think that's the journey. So I don't really know how I got started, really, right? Because if it's really a journey, then there's many starting points, right? And many stops, starts and stops, and sometimes false starts even, right? So.
I hope that during this conference, you will have opportunity to share your journey to where you are. I was born in Hong Kong, and when I grew up, I only know that I am a person from Hong Kong. I have no idea I am an Asian. Until during college years, I went to Singapore to attend an ecumenical conference. And there, for the first time, I met people from different parts of Asia. And then I thought, oh, I am also part of the Asian people. So that development of Asian identity came when I had the opportunity to be exposed to the other Asian Christians and ecumenical leaders. And then when I came to the United States, suddenly I became a racial minority, which was completely shocking to me because I belong to 1/4 of humanity as Chinese. How would I become a minority? Minority of what? And for whom? So I still cannot wrap my head around this label as a minority. So I think that some of us have come to embrace or understand Asian or Asian American or Pacific identity as a process too. So I would like to ask our panelists to share with you their journey of embracing or understanding their own identity as Asian and Asian American. Because I think that the kind of understanding of identity really influences our own work. So I would like to ask them to say a little bit. This time, I want to begin with Gail, because she is third generation Chinese American. Between Gail and I, first generation, right? We cannot speak in Chinese, obviously, because Gail does not speak Chinese, third generation. So Gail, can you share a little bit about your journey?
As Pui-Lan said, I'm third generation Chinese American, and I'm the oldest of 12 children. My parents were both Chinese and Roman Catholic, so my mom didn't have much of a chance for fertility. I also grew up in the slums of Chicago, and my playmates were Puerto Rican and African American. I mean, sometimes we would go to Chinatown, but I really didn't hang around with many Asian Americans or Chinese Americans. My people were Puerto Ricans and blacks. But when we moved into a white neighborhood, of course, I started to, when I'm being called Chink and, any other racist name thrown at me, I started realizing that, yes, I am a Chinese American, an Asian American. And, but still, I did not know what that meant. I mean, even during college, even during the first part of my graduate school, I didn't know what that meant. I wasn't even a feminist in college, graduate school. I only became a feminist is when I started teaching at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota. But I came out as an Asian American when Pui-Lan invited me, or was it you, Rita, who invited me?
We were in Minnesota together.
Oh, okay. Well, some conference in Women in Religion on the politics of national identity. And that's when I had to think about what it meant to be an Asian American, and then and then to be an Asian American biblical scholar. It was a long process, but it began all the way back, in the slums of Chicago, right? In the slums of Chicago.
Yes.
So.
How about you, Nami?
I did not, like Pui-Lan, I did not claim Asian identity while growing up in South Korea. I didn't have to. I was Korean, but I mean, of course I'm Asian, but I didn't have to say I'm Asian. But I became an Asian woman when I landed in the United States. People say you're Asian woman. And I define my positionality as a US-based Asian woman. That is to acknowledge the Asian identity as a political identity in alliance with Asian Americans, whose history shows that Asian Americans have struggled against racist oppression regardless of your citizenship status, and oftentimes without having a chance to acquire citizenship due to racist US immigration law. So, and also I define my positionality as a US-based Asian woman to acknowledge relatively privileged positionality as a cisgender heterosexual woman and the implications of living in the US under current global politics. So for me, the identity Asian has changed from no consciousness of what it means to be Asian to identity that is given to me, that is imposed on me, than me actively claiming Asian as a political identity. So understanding of Asian as an identity, for me, it's both dangerous and useful. It can be dangerous, as is in the case of racist Orientalist use against Asians, but at the same time, it can be very helpful as it has been used by Asian Americans as a political signifier. So that's how I understand this changing understanding of Asian as identity.
How about you, Rita? Did your understanding of being a Japanese American have changed over time?
Oh, yeah. So between the time I came to the U.S. and left my family in Japan, I had a wonderful extended family in Japan where everybody was Japanese. My father took us to a military base in Okinawa, and that was the year I went to an American kindergarten and learned English, and I flipped. And I think that year in Okinawa was really crucial for my survival in the U.S. because it was still an Asian country, and so I didn't have any consciousness of being that different. The struggle with English was interesting, but I flipped. I was never really bilingual. So when I came to the United States for first grade to Fort Riley, Kansas, I already spoke English and didn't speak Japanese. I did not have accented English. So I remember my first day on a school bus in Fort Riley. You know how the bus is full and people step out and you work backwards so the people in the back get off last? So I stepped out into the row at my turn, and there was a girl behind me who came out, and I felt this sharp pain in the back of my head between my pigtails. And I looked around, and she had this pencil, and she'd stabbed me in the back of my head, and she said, "Don't you ever do that again, you dirty Jap." And I can remember she was a lot taller than I was. She had red hair and blue eyes and freckles, and her face was all like shrunken down into wrinkles of anger when she said that to me. So that was my first day on the school bus. So I started being really careful around white people, and when I played in the playground, I was really worried. It was just a difficult time to be Japanese. The military had only been integrated in 1948, so even the base itself was integrated black and white, but there were not many people like me. So I grew up feeling just odd. I didn't have a name for it. It was just, I remember thinking, what's wrong with being Japanese? I was like, that was so puzzling to me to be treated like that. And then that year in Mississippi was also strange. So I was like the only non-white person everywhere I went, and people stared at me, but they didn't treat me like they treated black people. They just found me odd. So I was so happy to go back to a military base. But my playmates like Gail, a lot of the people that I played with were black and Hispanic. There were both of those in the U.S. military at the time. So we both learned to dance from black people. Hey. So I was multicultural, I think, growing up. It was sort of like you just float between these cultures, and you hear people Spanish over here and black English over here. It was really in college when the civil rights movement erupted, and I realized there was a movement of people like me that didn't have a black experience and didn't have a Hispanic experience, but had another kind of experience. And it wasn't Asian American. There was an Asian American movement, but most of the people that I knew in college were Japanese Americans, and their families had been interned. And so all of that is when I really began to have what I would call an Asian American consciousness. And it's always been, for me, tied in some sense to activist work.
How about you, my aunt? Did you also have a journey in the development of your racial identity and consciousness?
It's like a drop in the sky. No. I would call myself a 1.5 generation Vietnamese American. And so the 0.5 generation, right, the in between, there's a Vietnamese expression for that. We're called, that generation, we're called pork bellies. Like half this, half that, right? So you're not really lean, not really entirely fat, right? You're in between. And so that's what the elders would call us, the pork bellies. Because we came to the U.S. before adulthood, right? Technically before 18, right? So really not having a formed identity yet, if you think about developmental psychology, but not truly U.S. born either, right? To have experienced a schism of consciousness where you thought you were one thing and then suddenly, you know, you're rudely reminded. You're always reminded that you are conspicuously invisible. Is what I would call it, right? That and not only within U.S. American cultural experience, but I think amongst Asian American cultural experience, right? You know, like the Vietnamese is a war, like Vietnam is a war, not a people or not a country, right? And so we knew that coming in. We are the new wave of FOBs, right? Fresh off the boat people. And so I think the journey of being like acutely aware that that's what you're stepping off the boat into, but then not really knowing, like not having examples of how to navigate that, right? And so then you have all these tactics and strategies that you all recognize, right? From trying to not stand out, right, to truly be invisible or to be conspicuous in a particular way, like the potluck, I'm calling it the potluck approach to bringing your culture to the table, except you're expected to bring the same damn thing every time, right? Because that's the only thing that they would recognize, right? So potluck doesn't work either. And so I think, if I can speak to this more, like the whole notion of how the architecture of my identity and my intellectual pursuit or intellectual desire, I'm using the language of Willie Jennings, has been choreographed either by wider culture or by the academia or even the ecclesiastical, the church culture, right? That my identity, you know, kind of has to abide by those scripts. So understanding that has been interesting for me and has informed my own research. And so I lean towards practical theology, religious education, empirical study, empirical research, because it allows me to kind of be nosy, to be curious about lived experience of faith and unfaith. You know, theology as lived experience of faith and unfaith, or love and hate, right? Actual, the material reality of a human existence as a starting point of theological reflection. My field, my disciplines, to use the multiple, has always honored that, right? So being able to connect to that. But I think there are two expressions that become that are the guiding tropes for me right now. One is hic sunt draconis, which is my version of the Latin expression. Who remembers that and where it appears? Hic sunt draconis, here be dragons. Oh. Right? The old Lennox globe in the 1500s, right? That is the expression and the symbol being dragons or serpents, right? On areas of the globe that are uncharted territories, right? Unknown, beware, dangerous waters, serpents are here, right? But in the original Lennox globe, that was my territory, right? But the region of my birth are the dangerous waters, right, where the serpents are, right? And so what does it mean to come from areas, territories, or waters that are deemed dangerous, right, by discoverers of the world? And if you actually are into zodiac signs, right, so there are 12 animals right, within the, so we kind of borrow the Chinese version, so there are dragons in my family too. So I love the fact that there are dragons that lurk about in the waters of knowledge that I navigate in, right? The other expression that I find helpful is we are legion, we are many, right? Flowing from the biblical world, right? That there's not one of us. And sometimes we take over, as in we, what do you call it, as we are mediated by mediums, right? Channeled through mediums, and then we occupy bodies, if you will, that may not look like ours, but that's how we speak, right? So
now I want to ask them the question: how their understanding of their own racial identity influence their work. And I want to start with Rita. Rita, many of us began our journeys reading your book, Journeys by Heart. But over this long career, you have produced many interesting volumes, like Proverbs of Ashes, and also the Saving Paradise, and more recently, you are into this moral injury research. Can you say a little bit about the trajectory of your own intellectual development?
Yeah, well, so I went to seminary of feminist, and Mary Daly and Letty Russell, some of the early feminist theologians were beginning to publish around the time I finished my master's degree. And I took 2 years off and went to Switzerland to study there and majored in skiing. But I did study theology at the University of Basel for a little while and realized, oh my God, it's so patriarchal, I can't stand it. But I came back to do feminist theology, and I struggled. But I decided that because at the time I was told if you do a feminist dissertation, you won't get a job. This is 1977, 78. I decided that what I was really also interested in was interfaith dialogue because I have a Buddhist family background. I think my basic meaning neural system was most shaped by Japanese Buddhism, not Western thinking. So I have a sort of bicameral brain where often the words coming out of my mouth don't quite match what I'm thinking. So I kept struggling with that. And I finally took a Christology class because I wasn't even sure it was possible to be a feminist and a Christian, so how can you do dialogue with Buddhist Christian dialogue when you're not sure where you fit in that dialogue? So I got talked into the professor of that class. I wrote a really angry feminist critique of the androcentrism and paternalism structured into basic Christology that we were reading, and I thought I'd flunk the class, and instead I got an A, and he told me, write your dissertation on this. And I was like, why? I won't get a job. He said, it doesn't matter. You are saying things that haven't been said that need to be said, and you won't finish the other topic because this has got your heart. You're angry enough to finish. So I wound up writing in Christology, but I got really stuck trying to figure out what I really thought about that question, is it possible to be a feminist and a Christian? And I realized when I actually had a dream that it popped out in my head. When I woke up, I knew the answer, and which was not if you think of Christology as how it's been written. And so this is what I realized was Western feminist Christians tend to do a lot of deconstruction, analysis, critique. But there's not much solution. There's not much nourishment. There's a lot of anger there, but not a lot of nourishment. And that wasn't enough for me. And I didn't want to write another book like that. And the only book that was a positive offering was, at that time, was one that was done by an Episcopal person that was an incarnational Christology. And there was something about that also wasn't quite right to me. And I realized someplace, that was what the dream helped me realize, was love is relational. Jesus can't embody it. It has to be embodied in relationships. So and I think that's a very Japanese sensibility. I wouldn't have known, I didn't articulate it to myself at the time, but in reflecting upon it, of course, the group matters more than the individual. Of course, when you're talking about groups or love, that's what you're talking about, is that you don't matter as much as all the people that love you. It's a nexus of love that makes love possible. So that's when I got interested then in feminist work on love instead of deconstruction and Christology. And I found the book by Audre Lorde on uses of the erotic path, and then this woman in Hawaii, Trask, who's a Hawaii independence activist, but she wrote a book on Eros as well, the power of feminist theory, Eros and power. And so that concept of desire, of Eros, was to me what grabbed my heart. It just made so much sense to me, not like the love of self-sacrifice and friendship and the sort of standard Christian understandings of love, but really where your heart is grasped. And what you love the most isn't something you're going to give yourself away to die for it, so you want to engage with it and live with it. It's like Dolores Williams, whose critique of Christology, somebody asked her, well, what are you willing to die for? And she said, if you're a minority person, you ask that question, they'll kill you for sure. So it's a wrong question to ask. The question is, what would you give your life for? What would you live for, right? So that's how I wound up writing A Christology of Erotic Power. That was the title of my dissertation. And Journeys by Heart became the title of the book. And the subtitle of the book is Christology of Erotic Power. So I would just say that process for me in graduate school has always been how I've looked at any book project I've done. If I haven't got a positive solution that makes sense to me, and then a critique is just anger, it's corrosive, it's not enough. So I think the book that I did, there are two books that are weak on that they were so early in the field that it was hard to see where the research would go, but there's sort of hints of a solution, and that's Casting Stones, the book on prostitution. Where we came out was it has to be decriminalized, but that's not, I mean, we didn't really develop that. And then in Soul Repair, it's stories of moral injury and military veterans, but it was such a new field of work that we didn't really say much about how you recover from it. And that's been the work I've been doing now, is helping figure out what makes recovery possible.
Yeah. For many years now, I have tried to persuade Gail to publish the first book on Asian American feminist biblical interpretation. And I hope one day she will collect all these beautiful chapters she has written to publish this book. So I want to ask Gail to share her own trajectory, because as you know that, Gail has worked both in feminist biblical hermeneutics as well as ideological criticism. And so can you say a little bit about, you said that you came out as an Asian American biblical scholar. So what happened next?
Yes. Okay. So at that conference where I came out, I do remember saying, I am the first Roman Catholic Asian American doctoral professor in Hebrew Bible in the world. And at the time, basically, that was true, okay? Now, I had to, before that, you have to know that, I don't know if anybody here is doing a doctorate in Hebrew Bible, but I was in New Testament and then went to Old Testament. So I had, in my degree program, had to pass 6 language exams, okay? And my training was basically in historical criticism. And so I had to plow through all this German stuff. So the notion, even the notion of doing an Asian American reading did not happen until 1994, okay, 1994. And what I had to do first to do that was to find out about the history of my own people, particularly the Chinese. So I started with the Chinese first because I'm Chinese, but just to write about the history, all right? In writing about the history, then I started seeing themes. Is there anything that I could, use as a lens to interpret this body of sacred text? And the first one was the notion, which I'm sure all of you are aware of, the model minority and the perpetual foreigner. And I saw that I was able to read the book of Ruth through those 2 different lenses. Now, I am still trying to figure out what Asian, of course, all right, I'm supposed to do this book. And yes, I have been writing on it. How to do a contextual analysis of this sacred text. And so it's still a process for me. It's still a process for me. Right now, it's more where I'm geared. It's just from my own social location, coming from the slums, all right? Working on those who are marginalized in the biblical text, all of those, the women we don't talk about, the wet nurses, the midwives, the refugees, the wise women, all right, all of those women who are marginalized, and also where my Asian American biblical hermeneutics is also going is through intersectional analysis. So I cannot simply do it simply from an Asian American perspective. It has to be done from a class perspective, a gender perspective, post-colonial perspective, a sexual perspective. So it's all mixed in together. So that's what I am trying to figure out in how I go and interpret this text from a very complex, sometimes fractured identity, all right, and how to bring that together in the sacred text. So that's.
Thank you. Mayan, can you share your journey, especially writing the book that is just so moving, Reset the Heart?
It's amazing to hear that coming out of the Kwok Vilan, right? So, thank you. It's surreal. I think the continuum, I think our experiences are a continuum, right? I think we can reduce the continuum down to two hermeneutic straitjackets. And when we think about how to engage our Asian American identities, one is everything that comes out of your mouth is automatically defined as Asian or Asian American. So for me, it was that because I came as the second wave, not third wave, right? And so then there's already that consciousness that, there are contextual theologies and contextual theologians, and therefore I'm pigeonholed into one by default, right? So anything that comes out of my mouth is, oh, that's lovely Vietnamese, theological reflection. I'm like, no, it's just a theological thought. Oh, it's a lovely Vietnamese theological thought, right? I'm like, so that's one straitjacket, and the other is to, and our reaction, I think, for some of us, minoritized scholars, is to reject that, to say, no, I speak from a more universal perspective, right, to refuse that. But those are two extremes that are not the only two options in the continuum, right? And so the fact that I have to recognize, my very first published essay was actually not in my field of training at all. It was a piece of cross-textual reading of the characters of Ruth, Lot's wife, unnamed character, and a Vietnamese literary figure, character called Do Thị, a pillar, a stone pillar. So a pillar of salt, a stone pillar in Vietnamese mythology, and a pillar of virtue, Ruth, right? But that allowed me, right? So it allowed me to kind of play a little bit with the cultural repertoire, but then to realize, though, that there the deep reservoirs that I haven't really tapped. So the we are legion is real in the sense that there are multiple Vietnams that I never knew, that I have to kind of retrieve. And it's not going back to the native or authentic, because there, right? The whole kind of continuity between what's China, what's Vietnam, what's the Cham kingdom that becomes modern, era, all of that was outside of the canons of my higher educational experience, right? So to tap into that, to realize that I am legion, because there are legions of knowledge worlds that, right, are waiting for me to tap into. So I think that's one last thought. That being said, I think I am owning the fact and using, being informed by my own discipline and learning from how neuroscience, what Rita just said about the bicameral brain, I think neuroscience and education teaches us this lesson that is serious, and it's an alternative from kind of identity politics. And that is, our brain, right, is wired based on social experience. So to say that I have a Vietnamese, 1.5 generation Vietnamese American brain, in that particularity means something. That means my cultural, social, political experiences has created neural synapses, right, that allows me to see or image the world in a particular way that no other Vietnamese woman of my same experience would be able to image, right? That the brain functions that way. So that's true for each of us here too. So what does it mean to occupy that particular hermeneutic and also kind of awareness of how our brain images the world? That as a starting point for theological discovery, I think would be amazing. right?
Thank you. Naomi, you also have a very interesting intellectual trajectory. You began your journey interrogating the term Asian. And then you also have studied Korean religious right and also the intersection of theology and US militarism. But I am also very impressed by your scholarship, connecting the Black experience in the United States and the Asian and Asian American experience. Can you share your journey?
I will limit that to the chapter I contributed to your book. And the caveat is that I'm still, developing the work on Afro-Asian connections. So it's an ongoing work. And one of the questions I'm often asked is, what is it like teaching at Black college as an Asian woman? More specifically, oftentimes, so how you Korean woman ended up there teaching religion in the Bible Belt? Korean, Black? So why so much curiosity and concern over Asian women teaching at Black institution? Yeah, so there must be some historical context and explanations for that. So my work on Afro-Asian connections actually started with me wanting to find out not so much about why so much conflict between Black and Asian, but more about if there are any or has been there any historical moment or incidents of Afro, Black, and Asian solidarity. So that's one, studying. Rather than looking for or, studying more about the conflict aspect, was there any Afro-Asian solidarity or connection? So that's one starting point. And then the other thing is, of course, this Asian identity, influenced my work, but also the realization of the importance of place where I live, where I teach, where I encounter all sorts of people. The importance of place in relation to knowledge production and the work of solidarity. So one of the question I'm always asking is, how much am I committed to the welfare of the local communities without losing transnational connections? And then my local communities include, first and foremost, my teaching community, my students, my Black students, and people, their beloved communities, and Korean immigrant community, and larger Asian American communities, and also other racial ethnic minority communities. So the importance of place also affected my work on this. And the other last thing I want to connect to my work is that while there has been a burgeoning of scholarship on Afro-Asian connections or Black Orientalism in ethnic studies, that hasn't been the case in religious theological studies. So I was hoping to continue a dialogue to advance more interactions, discussions among African American and Asian American religious theological scholars. And despite the interest on this subject matter, I think this can be very significant work for anyone who is interested in the interdisciplinary work on white supremacy, imperialism, racism, Christian hegemony, and the questions of citizenship and Americanness. So that's I'm working on, but it's not complete. So this is more like I'm still figuring that out.
Thank you. As you can hear, their scholarship and their embodied knowing is so much tied to the conference theme, Journey Towards Justice. But I wonder if they have something to say directly to this theme, Journey Toward Justice. Anyone who wants to share your reflections on this particular theme?
Right now, my intellectual and work project is this thing called moral injury, which I actually think anyone who winds up going into religion and theology is dealing with some break in what they thought to be true, that they believed in, their value system, that they're trying to sort out how it failed us or betrayed us. So I think the entire biblical corpus is a moral injury corpus. Most religious literature has this embedded in it. It's this search for meaning when the old meaning doesn't work anymore. This is how I'm now framing this. For the last 250 years in the formation of nation states and all our transnational things and the places we wind up located have to do with the emergence from the Western imperialist system of something called high modernism, which values abstract universals and rationality and has total faith in science. And that process has erased not only environmentally with monocrop abstract agriculture and forests that, and I mean it's an environmental and a human cost to all of that, which has erased the actual complexity of what we call traditional or practical knowledge that comes from our cultures and traditions in our various actual locations, to the sake of a set of universals. And in monocrop agriculture, it's taken 100 or more years to figure out what a big disaster that's been. And I think moral injury is now the great challenge to the whole way mental health and physical health has been understood in high modernist terms, that if you can figure out the chemical that makes somebody's brain not work and they're depressed and you give them that chemical, that somehow will fix them. So there's this strange reductionism in all of that. The only resistance to that high modernism in the nation-state system are dissident, localized movements. And so I'm interested in what can sustain that kind of movement work, because it's hard work, it takes a lot of time. And one of the factors, I think, in burnout and too much anger and intensity and then burnout and flame out and the constant rotating of leaderships that doesn't take care of itself, all kinds of things like that, has to do with moral injury, that people come to social movements because they recognize something hasn't worked, it's wrong, and they're trying to change it, but they often come with their own trauma. And the movements themselves, I think, don't attend to that, because the anger is so much energy for doing things and getting things in and protesting and yelling at people and carrying your sign in a march, that there's not enough attention paid to what that anger is doing to the movement itself. So that's one of the areas. Sue has been working with me on this too. We're trying to form a cadre of movement chaplains that attend to those needs and attend to the dangers of anger and people not flaming out because then their trauma, usually that anger is from the trauma, and if you don't deal with the trauma that's creating the anger, they keep reliving the anger, and that will kill you. It will literally, physically kill you.
Anyone else who wants to talk about this theme?
Nami, I was impressed with what you were saying about working from the place where you are at. And because that's why I have started, working with the local community. I joined the CERT team. I'm not sure if any of you have CERT, Community Emergency Response Teams, in your area. If you do, you can go into the training. I did the training and I'm on the team, to be kind of before the community responders, before the first responders come. This is in terms of some disaster. If they are looking for missing persons, we would, go out. So that is how I am trying to get involved in my own community. We work with the Claremont Police, which, they were always pigs when I was, as the hippies. But, when you, have to go out with the, when you go out on patrol with them, you know, and I do all sorts of things. So you find out more about your local community. At least I am finding out more about my local community, you know, from my own work in CERT. So.
I think PANAAWTM has emphasized the importance of this place-based politics, not limiting ourselves into the identity politics. You know, we've been having this conference over 34 years, and then wherever we go, you know, we try to work with the local community and bringing in activists or scholars, artists in conversation with, you know, what we are doing. And that's actually, you know, what I learned about the importance of place as well. And in terms of the contribution to the theme of the conference in relation to Afro-Asian connection is that I think the subject matter itself, Afro-Asian connection, is important, especially in light of this pervasive anti-Black racism in the larger society as well as within Asian American communities. Also, I think, you know, my work is contributing in terms of through its perspective and approach, because there has been discussion on cross-racial solidarity, but the dominant narrative has been Afro-Asian brotherhood. So I'm trying to bring in transnational feminist perspective. You know, what's the importance of employing that perspective that is also intersectional? And then lastly, I think, you know, also I'm trying to, I mean, my work is trying to call for the praxis of solidarity. And the praxis of solidarity can come in multiple ways. And for scholars in our field, it can mean, you know, interacting and, you know, interacting and having more conversations with the other racial ethnic minority scholars and teaching their scholarship. And then also, you know, engaging in critical self and collective reflection on the ways in which Asian Americans have been complicit in the oppression of Black, you know, Americans through anti-Black racism. So I think those are the three interrelated way my work, I can say, you know, contributing. Not a lot, but, you know.
So the two interconnected incidents that's really kind of captivated, arrested really my thinking and my work in the last 5 years was August 9, the first is August 9, 2014, the shooting death of Michael Brown in St. Louis, Ferguson, Missouri, which was about 15 miles from where I was living and teaching then at Eden Seminary in St. Louis, right? And then the protest movements that picked up on kind of the global, right, uprisings a few years before that, right? And so August 9 was about 3 or 4 weeks before the start of the new academic year for us in St. Louis. And can you imagine how, you know, everything that we had worked towards planning for the whole academic year, syllabi are done, textbooks are ordered and whatnot, and suddenly this happens and you realize that you cannot start on day one with everything that you had prepared. Right? So what does it mean to be attuned to one's place? And that vocation arises out of one's placeness and not something that you know, it's a calling that drops from the sky and then you go to a place and then you live it out. No, it's born out of where we are, right? And so that was the first incident that really kind of arrested all of my assumptions about how I prepare myself for this work as a theologian and an educator. 5 years later, just about a couple months ago, February 2019, I'm back again in St. Louis, this time participating in the special general conference of the United Methodist Church, where, I can't remember how many delegates now, right, the vote, for a plan that would, if affirmed, constitutionalize the exclusion of certain persons from our church body. And I am there with students and with faculty colleagues witnessing how really the architecture and the mechanisms of entire system worked in concert with one another, right? And each one of us being complicit in that. So this picks up on some of the ideas that the panel last night talked to us, right? That we can have infrastructures in place that just normalize everything, right? And gives logics to why things have to be the way they are, right? And so in the book, in my recent book, I was caught up with the idea that violence doesn't just happen It always comes with internalized logics. There's always an explanation for why it has to be that way, right? And so I think the imperative for my field, which is religious education and practical theology, I went back to, when I received Pulan's question, I went back to Maria Harris, the late Catholic practical theologian, who wrote a book on Jubilee as kind of a biblical foundation for understanding of justice work for the field. So it's a few decades now. But what she said is the demand for our work is liberation. The emphasis is connection, relationships, right? The corrective to our work is suffering, as in human suffering, right? The power of our work is imagination, and the vocation is the repair of the world, tikkun olam, right? And if that as the mantra for the work, you know, how am I guided by the demand for liberation, the corrective of suffering, human suffering, and how am I powered by imagination? Because the forces of violence or hegemony is a force of disimagination, because it forces me to image the world in a particular way and feeds me with all sorts of logic to say that's how it is, right? Working against that is, as the panelists said last night, is a whole lot harder than coming up with new policies, a new, you know, alternative, a supplement to this, a supplement to that, because it's reorganized, shifting the entire house, if you will. Rebuilding the plane while you're mid-air, right? That's the work. So that's a tall order.
Isn't this a wonderful panel? Please join me in thanking the panelists. Now, we have sat for such a long while, and our body really needs stretched. Many years ago, when Dr. Wan Ho was with us, she taught us Qigong. So I would like to invite her to come forward so that we can learn to stretch our body before we engage each other.
All these qi things, and students always ask me, where is my qi? I have no qi. It's your energy. You have no energy, then you die, right? So I taught them a very simple way to feel your qi. So several years ago in PANAAWTM conference, in the morning, we do this practice. And Prilan really like it and still remember it. So asked me to show 2 motions this time. And then maybe in the later, I have a chance I can teach you the whole sections. Only 6 motions and very, very simple. But after that, usually people will tell me they can feel the qi. So we do it, okay? Okay, so please stand up. This is like the birds, flying birds. Very good. So, you follow me? So we just do this. Very simple. Okay, kneel down. Turn left. Okay, stand up. Okay. And then kneel down a little bit. Turn to the other when you do your hand, move down and up, and like this kind of circle, okay? Start it. Right side, left side, and move your waist, follow your hand. And you can use your exhale and inhale to match your movement. Inhale, exhale. Okay. When Taijin in front of you, inhale, and then you change your hand on the side, exhale, inhale, exhale.
Thank you very much. Dr. Ho has kindly promised that during the interest group hour, that she is going to teach you those 6 movements. And I have not only learned it and practiced it, I have taught different students to do it, and they find it very helpful. So interest group Qigong will be after the lunch in this room, if you want to learn the other movements. And now, I would like to invite you to talk to the person next to you, and then to share with the one next to you what were the highlights of the panel for you. What did you want to remember? What inspires you, or something you want to remember, to take away from the panel. So can you just form groups of 2, because we are going to have this exchange for a few minutes before we open up for question and answer from the panel.